I have an old-fashioned belief that I should expect to make money in things that I understand. And when I say understand, I don't mean understand, what the product does or anything like that. I mean understand what the economics of the business are likely to look like 10 years from now or 20 years from now. I know, in general, what the economics of, say, Wrigley chewing gum will look like 10 years from now. The internet isn't going to change the way people chew gum. It isn't going to change which gum they chew. If you own the chewing gum market in a big way, and you've got Double Mint and Spearmint and Juicy Fruit, those brands will be there 10 years from now. So I can't pinpoint exactly what the numbers are going to look like on Wrigley, but I'm not going to be way off if I try to look forward on something like that. That evaluating that company is within what I call my circle of competence. I understand what they do, I understand the economics of it, I understand the competitive aspects of the business. There can be all kinds of companies that have wonderful futures, but I don't know which ones they are. I've given talks in the past where I carry with me a 70-page, tightly printed list, and it shows 2,000 auto companies. Now, if at the start of the 20th century, you had seen what the auto was going to do to this country, the impact it would have on the lives of then your children and grandchildren and so on. It transformed the American landscape. But of those 2,000 companies, 3 basically survive. And they haven't done that well many times. So how do you pick 3 winners out of 2,000? I mean, it's not so easy to do. It's easy when you look back, but it's not so easy looking forward. So you could have been dead right on the fact that the auto industry, in fact, you probably couldn't have predicted how big an impact it would have. But you wouldn't have, if you'd bought companies across the board, you wouldn't have made any money, because the economic characteristics of that business were not easy to define. I've always said the easier thing to do is figure out who loses. And what you really should have done in 1905 or so, when you saw what was going to happen with the auto, is you should have gone short horses. There were 20 million horses in 1900, and there's about 4 million horses now. So it's easy to figure out the losers. The loser is the horse. But the winner was the auto overall, but 2,000 companies just about failed. A few merged out and so on. There were 3 companies, auto companies, in the Dow Industrials in the 1920s and 30s. Studebaker, Nash Kelvinator, and Hudson Motor. Now those names are all familiar to me, and maybe some of them are familiar to you, but they're not making any cars. They didn't make money, and yet at one time, they were in the Dow 30. They were the aristocrats of American business, and they got creamed. So figuring out the economic characteristics of the winners in a wonderful business is not easy. In North Carolina, Orville and Wilbur took off. Well, I guess Orville took off and Wilbur watched. I'd have been Wilbur. But if you could have seen the future of the airline business from that point forward and how that would transform things, it would have blown you away. And it's excited people, incidentally, ever since. But if there had been a capitalist at Kitty Hawk, he should have shot Orville down. I mean, because it's done nothing but cost investors money. There were over 400 airplane companies in the 1920s and 30s alone. There was in Omaha. There was in Nebraska. We were the Silicon Valley, apparently, of aircraft. And they all disappeared. It's been a terrible business. At the end of 1991, if you'd added up the aggregate earnings from all airline companies with billions poured in, since Wilbur and Orville were down there, they came to less than 0. The number of passengers went up every year. The importance of the industry was dramatically increased decade by decade, and nobody made any money. So figuring out the economic consequences. TV. I think there's, 20, 25 million sets a year sold in the United States. I don't think there's one of them made in the United States anymore. I mean, you'd say TV set manufacturer, what a wonderful business. I mean, everybody, nobody had a TV in 1950, or thereabouts, 45 to 50. Everybody has multiple sets now, but nobody in the United States has made any real money making the sets. They're all out of business. The Magnavoxes, the RCAs, all of those companies. Radio was the equivalent of the 20. Over 500 companies making radios in the 1920s. Again, I don't think there's a a U.S. radio manufacturer at the present time. But Coca-Cola, what was it, 1884 at Jacobs Pharmacy or whatever, the fellow comes up with something, a lot of copiers over the years, but now you've got a company that is selling roughly 1.1 billion 8-ounce servings of its product, not all Coke, Sprite, and some others, daily throughout the world 117 years later. So understanding the economic characteristics of a business is different than predicting the fact that an industry is going to do wonderfully. So when I look at the internet businesses, or I look at tech businesses, I say this is a marvelous thing, and I love to play around on the computer, and I order my books from Amazon and all kinds of things, but I don't know who's going to win. And unless I know who's going to win, I'm not interested in investing. I'll just play around on the computer. And defining your circle of competence is the most important aspect of investing. It's not how important, how large your circle is. You don't have to be an expert on everything. But knowing where the perimeter of that circle of what you know and what you don't know is, and staying inside of it, is all important. Tom Watson Sr., who started IBM, said in his book, he said, "I'm no genius," he said, "but I'm smart in spots, and I stay around those spots." And that is the key. So if I understand a few things, and I stick in that arena, I'll do okay. And if I don't understand something, but I get all excited about it because my neighbors are talking about it, the stocks are going up and everything, I start fooling around someplace else, eventually I'll get creamed, and I should. Yeah.
Good morning. I know you're famed for your success, but I was curious if there were any particular moments in your life that, or mistakes or failures that you've made that were particularly memorable, what you may have learned from them, and if you had any particular advice for the students here in dealing with discouraging circumstances.
Yeah, I've made a lot of mistakes. Biggest mistake, well, not the biggest, necessarily the biggest, but buying Berkshire Hathaway itself was a mistake, because Berkshire was a lousy textile business, and I bought it very cheap. I'd been taught by Ben Graham to buy things on a quantitative basis. Look around for things that are cheap, and that I was taught that, we'll say in 1949 or 50. It made a big impression on me. So I went around looking for what I call used cigar butts of stocks. And the cigar butt approach to buying stocks is that you walk down the street and you're looking around for cigar butts, and you find this on the street, this terrible looking, soggy, ugly looking cigar, one puff left in it. But you pick it up and you get your one puff. It's disgusting, you throw it away, but it's free. I mean, it's cheap. And then you look around for another soggy, one puff cigarette. Well, that's what I did for years. It's a mistake. Although you can make money doing it, but you can't make it with big money. It's so much easier just to buy wonderful businesses. So now I would rather buy a wonderful business at a fair price than a fair business at a wonderful price. But in those days, I was buying cheap stocks. And Berkshire was selling below its working capital per share. You got the plants for nothing. You got the machinery for nothing. You got the inventory and receivables at a discount. It was cheap. So I bought it. And 20 years later, I was still running a lousy business, and that money did not compound. You really want to be in a wonderful business, because the time is the friend of the wonderful business. You keep compounding, it keeps doing more business, and you keep making more money. Time is the enemy of the lousy business. I could have sold Berkshire, or perhaps liquidated it, and made a quick little profit, one puff. But staying with those kind of businesses is a big mistake. So you might say I learned something out of that mistake, and I would have been way better off taking what I did with Berkshire is I kept buying better businesses. I started the insurance business, See's Candy, the Buffalo, all kinds of things. I would have been way better doing that with a brand new little entity that I'd set up rather than using Berkshire as the platform. Now I've had a lot of fun out of it. I mean, everything in life seems to turn out for the better, so I don't have any complaints about that, but it was a dumb thing to do. I went into US Air. I bought a preferred stock in 1989. As soon as my check cleared, the company went into the red and never got out. I mean, it was really dumb. I mean, I've got an 800 number I call now whenever I think about buying an airline stock. I call them up any hour that, fortunately, I can call them at 3 in the morning, and I just dial and I say, my name's Warren, I'm an aeroholic, and I'm thinking about buying this thing, and then they talk me down. I mean, it takes hours sometimes, but it's worth it, believe me. If you ever think about that buying an airline stock, call me and I'll give you the 800 number, because you don't want to do it. But we got lucky in terms of how we eventually came out on it. But it was a dumb decision, all mine. And I've done biggest in terms of opportunity cost, eventual costs. I bought half interest in a Sinclair filling station when I was about 20 with a guy who was in the National Guard with, and I had about $10,000 then, and I put $2,000 in, and I lost it all. So that was 20%, and that means that the opportunity cost is now $6 billion of that filling station, which is a big price to pay for, getting to wipe a few windows and a few windshields and things like that. So actually I like it when Berkshire goes down because it reduced the cost of that mistake on an opportunity cost. But the biggest mistakes we've made by far, I've made, not we've made, biggest mistakes I've made by far are mistakes of omission and not commission. I mean, it's the things I knew enough to do, they were within my circle of competence, and I was sucking my thumb. And that is really, those are the ones that hurt. They don't show up anyplace. I probably cost Berkshire at least $5 billion, for example, by sucking my thumb 20 years ago or close to it when Fannie Mae was having some troubles, and we could have bought the whole company for practically nothing. And I don't worry about that if it's Microsoft because I don't know it. Because Microsoft isn't in my circle of competence. And so I don't have any reason to think I'm entitled to make money out of Microsoft or out of cocoa beans or whatever. But I did know enough to understand Fannie Mae, and I blew it. And that never shows up under conventional accounting. But I know the cost of it. I passed it up. And those are the big mistakes. And I've had plenty of them. Unless I tell you about them in the annual report, and I resist the temptation sometimes, unless I tell you about them in the annual report, you're not going to know it because it doesn't show up under conventional accounting. But omission is way bigger than commission. There's big opportunities in life have to be seized. We don't do very many things, but when we get the chance to do something that's right and big, we've got to do it. And even to do it in a small scale is just as big a mistake almost as not doing it at all. I mean, you've really got to grab them when they come, and because you're not going to get 500 great opportunities. That I got this money not because I'm a superior human being, not because I've done more for society than other people. I was wired the right way to be dropped into the United States at this particular time. I mean, it's a huge capitalistic society, and I'm wired, no credit to me, but I'm just born that way, so that I'm better at asset allocation than other people to some degree. Just like other people are better at all kinds of other things. And I was with two teachers out at Sun Valley that are doing more for society than I am, and this market system does nothing for them. Market system does all kinds of things for me. Gates says if I'd been born 5,000 years ago, I'd have been some animal's lunch, because I can't run very fast, can't climb trees. I mean, and I could tell that animal was chasing me, wait till you see how I could allocate assets, But it wouldn't have made any difference. So here I am, I'm born now, just very, very lucky. And the odds when I was born in 1930, the odds were 50-1 against me being born in the United States. That's a terrible set of odds to face. And yet I was dropped down here, And if I'd been dropped down in Peru or someplace or China, I mean, I wouldn't have had a chance. So society is what does it for you. And it should go back, in my view, it should go back to society. If you've been lucky enough to be dropped into a society where your particular wiring pays off big, that's just luck. And there's nothing wrong with being lucky. I don't feel guilty about it or anything else, but I also don't feel I have a lot of fun doing what I do, but I feel the money should go back into society, and it should go back as intelligently as it can. And the best way to do it intelligently is to have high-grade and intelligent people administering it at the time. And you don't know the problems that are going to be out there 10 years from now or 20 years from now or 30 years from now. But I do know if I've got a small number of high-grade, smart people, and high-grade is more important. If you gave me 20 extra points of IQ, but cheated a little on the high grade, I wouldn't take it because they got to be. There's so many chances to do things in a petty way or, to try to I mean, people get subverted in their own minds to their own interests rather than the interests of the institution. So I really want super high-grade people doing it, and I've got them. And I think the money might do a lot of good, it may do no good, but it'll be operating in fields where if it does some good, that good probably wouldn't have been done otherwise. Yep.
I was just wondering, there's a lot of differences between the recent boom and bust in the stock market and the one in the 1920s, but there's also a lot of similarities, and those similarities are allowing people to draw the conclusion that stock prices will be depressed for some time to come. Where do you disagree and agree with that conclusion?
Well, the whole century is quite interesting. If you take the 20th century, it was an unbelievable century for the United States. The GDP per capita, and that's the way to think of it as per capita. Sometimes they talk about our GDP versus Europe's, but if their population's the same every year and ours goes up 1%, you've got to, you know, in the end, you got to have a divisor as well as a numerator. And so GDP per capita in the 20th century in the United States went up 610%. Actually, qualitatively, it went up far more than that because you can't really measure, you know, certain things in medicine or whatever it may be and improvements. But just on a quantitative basis, it went up every single decade, including the decade of the 30s. So here you had 100 years when basically the U.S. citizenry was improving their lot decade by decade by decade. The 30s, it was up 13%. Best decade was World War II. The 40s, it's up 36%. The worst decade was the First World War. So you get sometimes the analogy, you know, you can get in trouble on analogies. But in any event, it was a huge period. Interestingly enough, there were 6 big periods in there for the stock market in both directions. There were 3 big bull markets. From 1900 to 1921, the Dow went from 66 to 71, less than a 10% move in 20 years. Less than 0.5% a year. You got dividends too, but 0.5%. So it didn't move. From 21 to 29, as you point out, it went from 71 to a high of 381 in September of 1929. Went up 500%. Well, obviously, the well-being of the country didn't go up 500% during that period, and the well-being of the country went up a whole lot more than 10% during that first 21 years. So you got this very uneven development. Then from September 1929 until the end of 1948, the Dow went from 381 to about 180. It was cut in half. And that was 18 long years. And yet the per capita GDP was moving right up during this whole period. So the economy was doing fine. From 48 to 65, the Dow went again from about 180 up to close to 1,000. Again, 5 for 1, which was far outstripping it. From 65 to 81, the Dow went down, literally. Well, again, per capita GDP. And then we've had this last period where it's gone up terrifically. If you take the whole 100 years, it went up 180 for 1. Every $1,000 became 180,000. But 43 and 3/4 years were those 3 big, huge bull markets, and 56 and 1/4 years were periods of stagnation. All in an economy that was doing fine, you know, year after year after year. 56 and 1/4 years, net, the Dow was down a couple hundred points during that period, and the other 43 and 3/4 years made up the rest of this move from 66 to 11,000 some on the Dow. So you say to yourself, how could it be that you could have a country that was doing better and better and better and better? Citizens were living, every generation was living better than the one that preceded it. But you had these huge changes, big gains a few times, long periods of stagnation. 20 years, I mean, that's a long time to do nothing. The answer is that investors behave in very human ways, which is they get very excited during bull markets and they look in the rearview mirror and they say, I made money last year, I'm going to make more money this year, so this time I'll borrow, you know, or the neighbor says, you know, I wasn't in last year when that neighbor was dumber than I made a lot of money, so I'm going to go in this year. So they're always looking in the rearview mirror. And when they look in the rearview mirror and they see a lot of money having been made in the last few years, they plow in and they just push and push and push on prices. And when they look in the rearview mirror and they see no money having been made, they just say, this is a lousy place to be. So they don't care what's going on in the underlying business. And it's astounding, but that makes for huge opportunity. Just huge opportunity. I mean, I lived through roughly half, in an investing sense, about half that period. And I've had that long period of stagnation from 48, from 65 to 82, 17 years. I wrote an article for Forbes in 1979. I just said, how can this be? Pension funds in 1970 put 100 and some % of their new money in stock because they were wild about stocks. Then they got a lot cheaper, and they put a record low in, 9% of their net new money in 1978 when stocks were way cheaper. People behave very peculiarly in terms of the reactions because they're human beings, and they get excited when others get excited, they get greedy when others get greedy, they get fearful when others get fearful, and they'll continue to do so. And you will see things you won't believe in your lifetime, and securities markets. And the country will do very well over time, but you will see these huge waves. And if you can stay objective throughout that, if you can detach yourself temperamentally from the crowd, you get very rich. And you won't have to be very bright. I mean, I'm sure you are, but it doesn't take brains. It takes temperament.